Just past 7:30 p.m., at a busy Costco in Corona, California, the sound of gunfire tore through the air. Chaos erupted. Shoppers screamed. People dropped to the floor or fled for the exits. Within seconds, dozens of calls flooded 911. Sirens wailed. First responders raced to the scene. What they found was not an active shooter hiding in the aisles. What they found was a family shot down during a grocery run. And the man holding the gun? An off-duty LAPD officer, a father, a trained law enforcement professional, who claimed he feared for his life. But why were there 10 shots fired? Why did a man with schizophrenia end up dead, and his parents bleeding on the floor? And why? Was no weapon ever found? Tonight we break down the shooting inside Costco that sparked outrage and left more questions than answers. Was it self-defense? Or a tragic misuse of power? Welcome to another episode of True Crime Mystery Vault. If you're ready to explore the full story, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Because this is just the beginning. And trust me, you won't want to miss a second of what comes next. Nestled just 50 miles east of Los Angeles, in Riverside County, sits the quiet city of Corona, California. Known for its suburban calm, tree-lined streets, and the hum of everyday life. It's a place where families go about their routines, largely untouched by big city chaos. On June 14, 2019, a warm Friday evening, the local Costco superstore was winding down after the evening rush. By 7:30 p.m., most of the after-work shoppers had come and gone. Inside, the atmosphere was calm. The store was quiet. Families were picking up the last few things for the weekend. And then, just before 7:45 p.m., the peace shattered. 10 gunshots, fired in quick succession. Aisles turned into chaos. Customers dove for cover. A young child cried. A father screamed. A mother collapsed. One man lay dead. 2 others were critically wounded. But what shocked everyone was not just the violence, it was who had pulled the trigger. An off-duty Los Angeles Police Department officer standing with his toddler son. And almost immediately the story began to fracture. Was it a confrontation gone wrong, or something else entirely? At 7:45 p.m., the quiet inside the Costco superstore was pierced by the sharp, terrifying crack of gunfire. In the span of mere seconds, 10 shots were fired. The shooter, 32-year-old Salvador Sanchez, an off-duty LAPD officer, standing in the aisle holding his 20-month-old son. The victims, a family of 3, Kenneth French, his father Russell, and his mother PAA, were out for their routine grocery run. Kenneth was struck 4 times. 3 bullets hit him in the back, 1 in the shoulder. His mother, PAA, was shot in the back. His father, Russell, was shot in the abdomen, losing a kidney in the process. Kenneth would not survive. Confusion reigned in the store. Customers dropped to the floor or sprinted for the exits. Others crouched behind carts and freezers. Aisles once filled with shoppers were now stained with blood and filled with panic. People screamed, children cried. Emergency responders rushed in, bracing for what they believed was an active shooter scenario. But what they found instead was Sanchez, confused, disoriented, but physically unharmed, standing over the family he had just shot. He claimed he thought he'd been shot in the head, claimed he saw a gun, claimed he feared for his life and his son's. But no one else saw a weapon. No gun was found near Kenneth or his parents. And in the chaos, witnesses began to tell different stories about what they had seen, what they had heard, and how it had all started.
I heard yelling, and all of a sudden just pop, and then pop, 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 pop. And everybody started running out the store. I was grabbing my wife and the daughter and putting them in front of me and trying to get them out the store. We were like 2 hours away, and we heard gunshots. We heard the first one, and then we heard 6 more. There were 7 shots altogether.
As the dust began to settle inside the Costco, one question hung in the air. Why? Officer Salvador Sanchez stood over 3 victims, 2 of them bleeding, 1 of them dead. He appeared disoriented, confused, but not physically injured. When questioned by officers at the scene,
Are you injured?
No, I guess not. I thought I got shot in the back of my head. And I see a blast, and I feel my head just get knocked down enough for me to fall. I see a blast, and I feel my head get knocked off, and I fall to the ground. I drop my son. I thought I got shot. I still feel pain on the side of my head.
Sanchez insisted he had been shot. He claimed he saw a muzzle flash, claimed he felt a powerful force strike the back of his head, so strong he believed a bullet had ripped through his skull. He described falling to the floor, dropping his son, and then looking up to see a man, Kenneth French, still standing over him, armed and ready to fire again. That, Sanchez said,
He said he thought I saw a black handgun. As I came over here, the deceased right there, we couldn't find the black.
But as investigators scoured the scene, the pieces didn't add up. No one else had seen a gun, no shell casings aside from Sanchez's, no weapon near Kenneth, Russell, or PAA French, no object resembling a firearm, nothing in Kenneth's possession that could be mistaken for a pistol. Officers even brought in drones to scan the tops of freezers and cabinets. Still, nothing. And yet, Sanchez was certain of what he saw. He described the supposed weapon in detail. A small, black, compact handgun. Something like a Ruger 380.
See your weapon? You know what? I'm not going to talk any further with them.
And when pressed further, Sanchez requested a lawyer and stopped speaking. Meanwhile, other voices in the store began telling different stories. Witnesses had seen Kenneth approach the sample stand where Sanchez stood, holding his child. Some described a sudden movement, Kenneth maybe slapping or pushing the officer. Others said they saw no provocation at all. One woman recalled hearing a sharp thud, like a head hitting the floor. "I thought he'd had a heart attack," she said. "He just dropped." Another remembered Kenneth standing there, fists clenched, looking angry. But no one, not a single bystander, saw a gun in Kenneth French's hands. PAA French, despite being shot herself, told police at the scene that her son had whacked the man. Later, in interviews, she called it a slap. Russell French, still reeling from a gunshot wound to his abdomen, was even more direct. "We didn't do anything. We were shopping, that's all." Sanchez was not arrested at the scene. In fact, he was allowed to go home that night, but he did ask to be taken to the hospital. There, he reported dizziness, head pain, and memory gaps. Doctors diagnosed him with a concussion, based on his report alone. Yet no bruises, no bumps, no cuts, no swelling, no visible evidence he'd even been injured. Still, his legal team would later argue that this head trauma was the key to understanding everything. They said the fall altered his perception, distorted reality, and triggered a life-or-death response. He believed his son's life was in danger. He believed he was under attack. And he acted the only way a trained officer could. But others weren't so sure. To the French family, it wasn't about perception. It was about reality. And in their reality, their unarmed son lay dying on the floor of a Costco, shot in the back, while the man who pulled the trigger walked free. Before the gunshots, before the blood, before the headlines, there was Kenneth French, a 32-year-old man with a soft face, an innocent smile, and a quiet presence. To some strangers, he may have looked like a man in his 30s. But to those who knew him, he was still a boy in many ways. Diagnosed with schizophrenia and an intellectual disability, Kenneth lived with his parents in Riverside, California. He was nonverbal. He couldn't always express himself with words. But he understood love. He loved familiar routines. He loved being with his mom and dad. He loved trips to the grocery store. That was his world, safe, simple, structured. His parents, Russell and PAA French, were his anchors. Devoted, protective, loving beyond words. The three were inseparable. Every week they shopped together at Costco. Every week, Kenneth pushed the cart or walked quietly behind them. It was never supposed to be dangerous. Not like that night. Not June 14th, 2019. But before that night, Kenneth's story stretched across continents. His parents were originally from Kolkata, India, married in 1986. They studied abroad, lived in the UK, and later moved to Ontario, Canada. Kenneth attended McMaster University in Hamilton. He studied accounting and financial management. He was brilliant. But then, the symptoms began. The confusion, the fear, the withdrawal. Eventually, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. His life, and theirs, changed forever. They moved to California to find better care. Kenneth lived at home. His days were structured, predictable, and his parents never stopped advocating for him. They were his voice when he didn't have one, his shield when the world was too much. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Kenneth had been experiencing complications. Doctors found fluid in his brain. He was taken off some of his psychiatric medications, temporarily, to address the issue. He had upcoming appointments, brain scans, neurological consultations. The family was concerned. They were hoping for answers. What they got instead was a tragedy. That night, they approached a food sample station. A simple stop, a small routine. That's when Kenneth, perhaps confused, perhaps agitated, made a sudden move. Witnesses said he may have slapped or shoved the man at the stand. That man was Officer Salvador Sanchez. Within seconds, Sanchez opened fire. And Kenneth, unarmed, confused, frightened, was shot 4 times. 3 times in the back, once in the shoulder. He collapsed in front of his parents. Pei and Russell were also shot as they reached for their son. One bullet struck Pei in the back. Another tore through Russell's abdomen. In those moments, Costco became a nightmare. Witnesses remember the sound of sobbing. Some recall seeing Russell, bleeding, clutching his son's hand, whispering, "Stay with me." Kenneth never made it to the hospital. He died on the floor, under the same fluorescent lights he had walked beneath so many times before. He died in front of his mother and father, 2 people who had spent their lives protecting him. And couldn't protect him from this. The French family would spend months in recovery, not just from physical wounds, but from something deeper. The grief of losing a son in such a public, violent, and senseless way. And every time his parents speak, their voices tremble with the same unspoken truth. Kenneth didn't have to die that night. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't a criminal. He was a vulnerable man. And now, he's gone. The next morning, headlines were already spinning. Off-duty officer involved in Costco shooting. Suspect dead, officer injured. But to Kenneth French's parents, it wasn't a headline. It was their son. It was the child they raised, the life they protected, the person they loved, gone. And to make it worse, the narrative was shifting quickly. Social media began praising the officer as a hero. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed Kenneth had opened fire first. Others said there had been a shootout in the middle of Costco. None of it was true, but perception moves faster than truth. And Officer Salvador Sanchez? He was not arrested. Not that night. Not the next day. He was placed on administrative leave, but paid. He returned to his family. Russell and PAA French remained in the hospital, fighting for their lives. Russell had undergone emergency surgery. Doctors removed a kidney. PAA suffered internal bleeding. Both were in immense physical pain. But the real wound? It was the absence. Kenneth was gone, and no one was being held responsible. The French family had been together for 32 years. Now they were broken by a man sworn to protect. Slowly, people began to question the official narrative. Why was Sanchez the only person who claimed to have seen a gun? Why weren't charges filed immediately? Why was there no body camera footage, no immediate arrest, no accountability? As more details emerged, the inconsistencies piled up. No gun was found. No threats were made. The family was walking away. The store's surveillance footage? Blurry, obstructed, and incomplete. It didn't show the moment Kenneth allegedly struck Sanchez. It didn't capture the expression on Sanchez's face. It didn't show fear or threat or a weapon. It showed chaos. It showed a family backing away. And then, shots. The public began asking hard questions. How many times had officers claimed to see weapons that weren't there? How many unarmed men, particularly those with mental health issues, had been shot without cause? Advocacy groups took notice. Civil rights attorneys stepped in. Petitions were launched. Demonstrations were held outside Costco, demanding justice for Kenneth French. News outlets followed the story more closely. What started as a local incident was now a national conversation. And through it all, Russell and Paye French spoke softly but clearly. Our son was not dangerous. We told him not to shoot. We begged him to stop. The heartbreak in their voices, palpable. But so was their resolve. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. And above all, they wanted people to remember that Kenneth was not just a victim. He was a person, a son, and he deserved to be treated like one, not as a threat, not as a target, and not as a footnote in another case where justice never came. The pressure was building. The French family's quiet voices were becoming part of a much louder movement. The question wasn't if justice would be served. It was when. In the days following the shooting, the investigation began in full force. Or at least, that's what the public was told. The Corona Police Department sealed off the store. They searched the aisles. They collected shell casings. They interviewed witnesses. And they reviewed the one piece of physical evidence that had everyone talking: the surveillance footage. But what that footage revealed only deepened the mystery. It didn't show Kenneth throwing a punch. It didn't show a gun. It didn't even show Officer Sanchez clearly. The camera's view was blocked. Aisles, shelves, displays, all obscuring what happened in those crucial first few seconds. When the video starts, Sanchez is already on the ground. His son is nearby. Kenneth is visible, wearing a striped shirt, being pushed away from the scene by his father. Paye gestures, possibly in fear, before retreating down the aisle. Then, almost instantly, Salvador Sanchez opens fire. According to investigators, just 3.8 seconds passed between the time Sanchez hit the ground and the moment he pulled the trigger. Less than 4 seconds. No time for de-escalation. No time to assess. No time to verify if there was even a threat. And during those seconds, Sanchez shouted multiple times, "I'm a cop! Police!" But the Frenches were already moving away. No threat. No gun. No confrontation. Just 3 people trying to leave. Investigators determined that the only weapon fired in that store was Salvador Sanchez's Glock. 10 rounds. 4 struck Kenneth French. 2 hit his parents. The remaining 4 bullets ended up lodged in store displays. No one else was injured. But the damage, emotional, psychological, and human, was already done. And as the investigation closed, one thing became painfully obvious. This wasn't a case with clear answers. This was a case buried in shadows, lost angles, and a truth that depended on who was telling it. After months of silence, the French family made a decision. If the criminal justice system wouldn't deliver accountability, then they would take their fight to civil court. In late 2019, with the help of prominent civil rights attorney Dale Gallipo, Russell and Paye French filed a lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles. The lawsuit was direct. Officer Salvador Sanchez, they argued, had acted recklessly. He had used deadly force without provocation, and most importantly, he had done so while invoking his authority as a law enforcement officer. Sanchez had shouted, "I'm a cop," multiple times before firing. He had used his badge, his training, his position, to justify an act of violence. The suit argued that this wasn't just an off-duty father acting on impulse. This was a trained officer who failed to follow basic principles of policing. Assess the threat, de-escalate, protect life. And the city of Los Angeles? They were responsible for hiring, training, and protecting that officer. The courtroom became a battleground of narratives. The defense claimed Sanchez acted in the heat of the moment, believing his son was in danger. But the French family's attorneys brought forward something even more powerful than words: a digital recreation of the shooting. Created by DK Global, the animation showed the French family calmly walking toward the sample stand. Kenneth, briefly startled, strikes Sanchez, who falls backward. Paye gestures toward him, then quickly tries to retreat. Russell pushes his son back, trying to end the interaction. And then, gunfire, bullets strike all three. The visual was devastating. In that courtroom, jurors weren't just hearing what happened. They were seeing it. The French family's legal team pointed out that Kenneth had his back turned when he was shot. 3 of the 4 bullets hit him from behind. Pei had no weapon. Russell never threatened the officer. The recreation filled in the gaps the store surveillance couldn't. It replaced grainy footage with clarity. And it left little room for doubt. The defense tried to refocus the case. They brought in medical experts who argued that Sanchez suffered from a concussion or traumatic brain injury, that his perception was altered, that what he believed mattered more than what was real. But belief doesn't stop bullets. And the jury knew that. In November 2021, after careful deliberation, a Los Angeles jury delivered their verdict. They found in favor of the French family. The city was ordered to pay just over $17 million in damages. It was one of the largest civil settlements of its kind. But to the Frenches, no amount of money could replace what they lost. No courtroom decision could bring Kenneth back. Still, the ruling meant something. It meant validation. It meant that someone, somewhere, saw them, saw their pain, saw their son. And for the first time since that horrific night in Costco, it meant someone, finally, was held accountable. And just as the family tried to find some peace, the LAPD made its own move. 10 months after the grand jury refused to indict, the Los Angeles Police Department concluded its internal review. Their conclusion was blunt. The shooting was out of policy. Another officer in the same situation, they said, would not have acted the same way. The use of deadly force was not justified. In response, Salvador Sanchez was fired. He was stripped of his badge, his pension, and his career. For the French family, it was another small measure of justice, but it wasn't enough, because while the civil trial gave them a verdict, the criminal justice system had yet to speak. The civil verdict was clear. Officer Salvador Sanchez had acted out of policy. The jury awarded the French family $17 million in damages, and the LAPD fired him. But even after all that, Sanchez still hadn't faced a single criminal charge. The Riverside County District Attorney had declined to prosecute. A grand jury was called, and they too refused to indict. Case closed. Or so it seemed. But the public pressure didn't go away. Protesters kept showing up. Advocacy groups demanded action. The French family refused to be silenced. And eventually, someone listened. In August of 2021, California Attorney General Rob Bonta made a stunning announcement. The state would be stepping in. Where the county had failed, the Attorney General's office would take over the case. After a full review, they filed formal charges against Salvador Sanchez. 1 count of voluntary manslaughter for the killing of Kenneth French. 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon for shooting Russell and Paa French. If convicted, Sanchez faced up to 30 years in prison. Suddenly, the stakes were real. And for the first time, Kenneth French's death was being treated like a criminal act. The charges sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Sanchez's attorney, David Winslow, responded immediately, calling the charges a political stunt. "He's an easy target," Winslow said. "They're using him to score points." The defense claimed that Sanchez was a devoted father, a decorated officer, and a man reacting to a traumatic brain injury. But the state saw something different. They saw a man who shot before assessing, who fired into the backs of a retreating family, who used his badge not to protect, but to defend his mistakes. The case finally went to trial in late 2023. Cameras were banned from the courtroom, but the transcripts and testimonies painted a vivid picture. The lead prosecutor, Deputy Attorney General Michael Murphy, laid it out plainly for the jury. Sanchez didn't assess the situation. He imagined a scenario. He saw a threat that didn't exist, and when the shooting ended, he built a false narrative. One that justified pulling the trigger, our fee, but couldn't explain why an unarmed family lay bleeding. Murphy told jurors that a reasonable person wouldn't react that way. A reasonable person, he said, would feel the back of their head to check for an injury. They wouldn't fire 10 rounds into a crowd of unarmed civilians. The defense pushed back hard. They focused on the 3.8-second window: the fall, the fear, the perceived threat. Sanchez, they said, had no time to think, just enough time to act. They emphasized that he didn't empty his magazine. He still had 3 bullets left. If he wanted to kill, they argued, he would have fired them all. They framed the shooting as a tragic mistake, not a crime, a reflexive reaction from a man protecting his son. On the stand, PAA French relived the horror. She said Kenneth had moved someone out of the way. That's all. Then a man shouted, "Police!" and opened fire. Russell, barely surviving his injuries, testified that he tried to stay alive, just to make sure the truth got told. If all of us had died, he said, this man would have walked away a hero. The jury listened. But by December 29, 2023, they were stuck. After 3.5 days of deliberations, they couldn't reach a unanimous decision. They were deadlocked. The judge declared a mistrial. Once again, no conviction. Once again, the system stalled. Sanchez walked out of court, free. His attorney, Michael Schwartz, said most jurors were in favor of acquittal, but he couldn't say how many. And he didn't need to. The damage had already been done. For Russell and PAA French, it was a familiar pain. Another blow. Another chapter of grief without closure. They left the courthouse broken. And Salvador Sanchez? He walked free, again. No handcuffs, no sentence, no consequences. For a second time, the system had looked at their son's death and done nothing. The mistrial sparked outrage. Activists, families of other victims, and legal experts spoke out. How many times does a man have to be killed before it counts? One protester asked. They were forced to relive every moment, again. Forced to sit in court while their son's character, his disability, his intentions, were dissected and doubted. Forced to watch the man who shot him, smiling, nodding, walking out. The law hadn't said he was innocent, but it hadn't said he was guilty either. Just undecided. And in that limbo, the French family was left waiting, again. Waiting to see if the Attorney General's office would retry the case. Waiting to know if justice was still possible. A hearing was scheduled for February 13, 2024. It would determine whether the state would bring the case back to trial, whether they'd fight again, or whether this case, like so many before it, would fade into silence. But the Frenches had made one thing clear. They were not done. They would keep speaking, keep pushing, keep fighting. Not just for Kenneth, but for every family who's lost someone to a badge and a bullet. And for every life misunderstood, misjudged, and mistreated. Because Kenneth wasn't a suspect. He wasn't a criminal. He was their son. And they will never stop saying his name. The case of Kenneth French is more than just a headline. It's a story of fear, misunderstanding, and irreversible loss. It's the story of a man who couldn't speak for himself. Shot by someone who never stopped talking about being afraid. 10 shots fired. 4 hit Kenneth. 3 hit his parents. And to this day, no one has been held criminally accountable. We often say the justice system is flawed, but for families like the Frenches, it's not a flaw. It's a wound. A deep, unhealed wound that reopens every time a life is lost and no one answers for it. Kenneth French was mentally ill, but that didn't make him dangerous. That made him vulnerable. And instead of being protected, he was treated as a threat. Shot, killed, and forgotten by the system. But not by his family. Not by his community. Not by those who watched this case unfold and saw themselves, or their loved ones, in Kenneth. This case isn't over. The state may still retry Salvador Sanchez. And the French family? They're still waiting. Still grieving. Still hoping that maybe this time, someone will be held accountable. Maybe this time, the system will listen. Maybe this time, justice will come. But even if it doesn't, their fight continues, and their son's name lives on. Kenneth French. Remember him. Pause. And now, we turn it over to you. Was this a tragic mistake by a father trying to protect his child? Or was this yet another example of unchecked power, with deadly consequences? Let us know in the comments. Do you think Salvador Sanchez should be retried? Was justice served here or denied? Hit the like button if you believe these stories deserve to be heard. Subscribe to stay updated on cases just like this. And most importantly, share this video, because someone out there might still be waiting for justice too.